The sky over the village of Kira, just outside Kampala, was bruised with gray clouds. Rain started slow, like tears testing the cheeks of the sky, then turned violent. The wind howled through the banana trees, slapping the leaves like angry hands. In a small, cracked house with faded pink walls and rusted gutters, Sarah sat on the cold cement floor of her kitchen. The kitchen was dark, except for the flickering flame beneath the blackened kettle she had forgotten on the charcoal stove. Smoke from half-burnt firewood twisted around her like a ghost. The smell of wet ash filled the room, sharp and bitter. She wasn't crying anymore. She had no more tears left to give. Her eyes were swollen from a week of weeping. Her voice was hoarse from begging. It had been 7 days since Paul left. He didn't slam the door when he left. No, it was worse than that. He walked out calmly, confidently, dragging his small green suitcase behind him as if he were taking a business trip. He didn't take much, just his clothes, his phone charger, and the pride she had built her marriage around. But before he stepped out, he looked at her, standing in the doorway with her trembling hands and wet eyes, and said it like a final sentence in a courtroom. "You are useless. Even poverty is tired of you." Then he walked into the morning. Son and Sarah collapsed onto the ground, breaking apart in pieces no one else could see. For a week, the house was silent. Neighbors whispered, children stared, and the village aunties clicked their tongues as they passed her gate. Sarah didn't care. She stopped cooking. She didn't sweep. She didn't bathe. The house began to smell of abandonment, as if it, too, had been left behind. Clothes were scattered, cups were unwashed, and rats began to nibble at the corners of the forgotten world Paul had left her in. At night, she lay on her thin mattress and listened to the silence. That silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It screamed of failure, of wasted years, of love that had decayed into contempt. She remembered everything. How they met at the market, both reaching for the same mango. How he smiled, how he spoke gently back then. How he held her hand during church. How he promised that, no matter what, they would build a future together. But promises in love, she now knew, were like sugar in hot tea. They melted quickly and disappeared. The last conversation they had was not even a fight. It was a statement. "There is no money. You do nothing. I come home to dirt, to empty pots. What use are you, Sarah?" She had opened her mouth to answer, to defend herself, to remind him that she had supported him when he lost his mechanic job, that she had borrowed sugar from the neighbor to make his tea, that she had stitched his socks and smiled through the hunger. But nothing came out. Instead, shame rose in her throat like smoke. And then he said it. Useless. The word stuck to her skin like oil. But on the 8th morning, the rain still falling in soft waves, the cold crawling under her clothes, Sarah did something strange. She stood up. She didn't know why. There was no great moment of inspiration. No light in the sky. Just a sudden ache in her stomach that reminded her she was alive. That morning, barefoot and still wearing the dress she had slept in for days, she walked to the back of the house. There, under a plastic sheet, was the old charcoal oven her late mother had used. She hadn't touched it in years. Her mother used to bake sweet banana bread and small wedding cakes for neighbors. People used to come to their house with coins in their hands and leave with smiles and crumbs on their lips. Sarah stared at the oven. Her hands moved on their own. She cleaned it. Then she swept the kitchen. Then she bathed. By noon, the kitchen looked different, not perfect, but breathing again. She found an old recipe notebook in a drawer. The pages were yellow and torn, but the handwriting, her mother's, was clear. The first recipe was for simple vanilla cupcakes. She didn't have much: 2 eggs, some leftover flour, and half a packet of baking powder. But she had hope. And that day, hope was enough. The first batch came out slightly burned at the edges, but the center was soft, warm, and sweet. The smell wrapped around her, pulled her out of her grief like hands lifting a fallen child. 4. The first time in days she smiled, a small, tired smile, but it was real. By evening, she had placed the cupcakes on a tray and walked to the main road. She didn't shout or beg anyone to buy. She just stood there. A man on a boda stopped, then a schoolgirl, then 2 women from the salon. She sold all 10. The next day, she bought more flour, and just like that, something began to shift. Not in the world, but in her. The days that followed felt like stepping stones over a deep river. Each one carried risk, fear, doubt, the quiet voice in her head whispering, "You can't do this." But Sarah kept walking. She began waking before sunrise, heating water, measuring flour with the edge of an old plastic cup, and mixing with her bare hands because she couldn't afford a whisk. Her tiny kitchen became her universe. The charcoal stove was her sun, and her dreams circled it like desperate planets. At first, she only made cupcakes. Simple, sweet, and soft. The kind children could hold without a mess, and women could enjoy with lukewarm tea on plastic chairs under mango trees. She gave 2 cupcakes to the boda riders who helped spread word around the village. She offered free samples at the small tailoring shop near the trading center. And slowly, like smoke curling into the wind, her name began to rise. They called her Mama Cupcake. Women came first. Some were curious, some were kind. One said, so she's still alive?" Another said softly, "You are strong, my sister. Bake them sweet." A primary school teacher asked if she could bring 10 to the staff room. Then a churchwoman requested a dozen for a prayer meeting. Sarah wrote down every order in a small notebook with a broken spine. She marked each page with a pencil that had no eraser. Mistakes had no place in her new life. Her fingers became cracked from kneading. Her eyes burned from smoke. Her back ached from standing, but none of it mattered. Each time she opened the charcoal oven and the scent of vanilla or banana or lemon filled the air, it felt like a miracle being born. Not the kind from the Bible, the kind that comes from survival. She didn't talk to Paul. She didn't need to. But word always travels in villages, faster than phones, faster than wind. He heard she was baking. Then he heard she had started taking small catering orders. Then someone told him she had opened a stall by the road with a wooden sign that read, "Sweet Fire Cakes by Sarah," painted in uneven red letters. That stall became her kingdom. It was no more than 4 wooden posts, a small table, and a faded umbrella that flapped in the wind. But it was hers. The first day she opened it, she wore her best dress, the blue one with the missing button at the waist. She brushed her hair and put on a bit of red lipstick she had found at the back of a drawer. She stood tall behind her stall, her hands steady, her heart pounding like a drum during a wedding dance. And customers came, slowly, then faster. Children with coins clutched in sweaty hands, men on bicycles, a nurse from the nearby clinic who said, "I heard your cakes heal sadness." Sarah laughed softly, almost surprised to hear joy in her own voice. She began saving money in a small margarine tin under her bed. Every coin counted. No electricity yet, no fridge, no electric oven. But each evening, she counted her money and her blessings with equal care. One day, after 3 months of selling from her stall, a woman in a blue car stopped by. She wore a badge that read, "Kampala Foods and Events." She tasted a cupcake, nodded, and asked if Sarah could deliver 100 mini cakes for a baby shower that weekend. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the offer. She had never made that many, but she said yes. That night, she didn't sleep. She baked in batches, rotating pans on charcoal, praying the fire would hold. The smoke stung her eyes until they turned red, but she didn't stop. At dawn, she packed the cakes in makeshift boxes tied with banana fiber. She rode with them on a boda, the wind whipping against her face, fear curling in her belly. The delivery was perfect. The woman from the car smiled and said, "Next time, I'll call you again." That next time came sooner than Sarah imagined. Then it came again. And again. 6 months passed. Sarah upgraded. She bought a second charcoal oven, hired a young girl from the village to help with cleaning and packaging. The stall became a small shack, then a painted kiosk. She designed a logo with the help of her cousin's son who studied art. It was a simple drawing, a cupcake with a flame on top, and underneath it, in bold letters, "Sweet Fire, baked from strength." But not everything was easy. Some days the flour would run out before payday, charcoal would get wet in the rain, customers would cancel, the boda boys would hike delivery prices. Sometimes doubt would creep back in like a shadow through a cracked window. But each time Sarah stood in her kitchen, she remembered the day Paul left, and the way his words felt like a knife in her chest. That memory became her fuel. She turned rejection into recipe and heartbreak into hustle. One night, as she cleaned her oven, the village's old widow, Mama Akello, came by holding a lantern. "My daughter," she said gently, "do you know, fire is two things? It destroys, but it also cooks food." Sarah looked at the embers glowing under the oven and smiled. "Yes, Mama, I know that now." By the time Sarah's story reached the local radio station, the dry season had arrived. The rains had stopped, leaving behind cracked roads and dusty air. The village air smelled of red soil, roasted maize, and new beginnings. Sweet Fire was no longer just a kiosk. It was now a name whispered in conversations across markets, school gates, and church meetings. Even women from the next town had started sending bodas to pick up boxes of her cupcakes. Some called her Madam Cake, others just said, "the woman who refused to break." And that's when Paul returned, not like a storm, not with loud apologies or grand gestures. He returned like a shadow, quiet, cautious, observing from a distance. No one told Sarah at first. It was the village that told her in its usual way. Sideways glances, sudden silences when she passed by, whispered jokes among the boda riders. Then, one afternoon, as she was cleaning the front of her kiosk with a broom made from dry grass, she saw him. He stood across the road near the kiosk where an old man sold used shoes. Paul wore a faded shirt and jeans that looked 2 sizes too big. His hair had grown rough. His shoes had no laces. But it was him. He didn't come forward. He just stood there, half hidden behind a metal pole, pretending to examine sandals he wasn't going to buy. Sarah froze for a second. Her hand gripped the broom tighter, her heart skipping like a drum line. But then, she turned back to her sweeping, not saying a word. That night, she didn't tell anyone what she had seen. But her mind replayed the moment again and again, like a scratched CD. There had been no joy in seeing him, only a strange sense of distance, like remembering a wound that no longer hurt but left a scar. She lay awake staring at the roof, remembering how his words used to dig holes into her spirit. The next day, she saw him again. This time, he was standing by the mango tree near the water tap, and the next day, by the market path. He never approached. He just watched. People started talking. "Hey, Sarah's husband is back. Ooh!" Maybe he wants to apologize. Men are like dogs. They go and come back when they smell food. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. But Sarah remained silent. She continued baking. She added more items to her menu: moist chocolate cake, pineapple tarts, and wedding cookies shaped like hearts. She bought an old fridge and painted it herself. She trained 2 more girls, Aisha and Miriam, to help with packaging and customer care. Her tiny team wore aprons with the flame logo. Business was good. Very good. And then came the phone call. It was a woman from Kampala, the the Ministry of Gender, Labor, and Social Development. She had seen a Facebook post about sweet fire from a blogger who passed through the village. She wanted to nominate Sarah for the Woman Entrepreneur of the Year award. Sarah didn't believe it at first. She thought it was a prank. But when the official letter came by courier, sealed in a big brown envelope with government stamps, she knew it was real. The award would be presented in Kampala City, in a hotel she had only seen on TV, with real cameras, real lights, and real people in suits. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. Her heart wanted to fly. The day she received it, she walked to her mother's grave behind the house and placed the letter on the tombstone. "I did it, Ma," she whispered. "They finally see me." The days that followed were a whirlwind, fitting for a new dress, arranging transport, practicing how to speak in front of big people. She even went to the salon, the same one where women used to gossip about her. They now clapped as she walked in, shouting, "Madam Kampala, and our very own superstar." On the morning of the ceremony, Sarah stood in front of her kiosk, waiting for the car sent by the ministry. It was a black Prado, shining like it had been dipped in oil. The driver stepped out in a white shirt and black trousers and opened the door for her like she was royalty, and that's when it happened. As she stepped into the car, she saw Paul standing at the back of the crowd that had gathered to wave her off. He looked smaller now, not just in size, but in presence. His shoulders slumped. His eyes, once so sure, so sharp, looked soft. He didn't speak, just stood there, hands in pockets, waiting. Maybe for her to wave, maybe for her to look. Maybe for her to stop everything, run to him and say, "Let's try again." But Sarah did not stop. She smiled, not for him, but for herself. Then she lifted her hand and waved once, slow and graceful, the way queens do when they leave the kingdom they built with their bare hands. And as the car pulled away, she never looked back. That night, in Kampala, she stood on a red-carpeted stage under a golden light. The award was heavy in her hands, a crystal flame mounted on a wooden base. When they asked her to speak, her voice was calm, clear, and unshaken. "I was once called useless," she said, "and I believed it. But rejection is not the end. Sometimes it is the fire that bakes the cake. I stand here today not because I was lucky, but because I refused to stay broken." The hall erupted in applause, and somewhere, far away, in a quiet village, a man sat alone in a small empty room, watching her speech through the shaky screen of a neighbor's phone. Success changes things, not just the clothes you wear or the company you keep, but the way the world tilts toward you. Yet, for Sarah, the more her name grew in Kampala and beyond, the more she found herself drawn back into silence. Not sadness, but reflection. Behind the clapping crowds, the shining award, the interviews, and the rising sales, she carried a quiet truth that she had never spoken, not even to her assistants, not even to herself. Because behind sweet fire, behind every soft, sweet bite of cake, there was a sorrow no one had tasted. The truth was, Sarah had not simply baked to survive, she had baked to grieve. It had started long before Paul's words cut her, before the day he packed his bag and left her in the shell of a home they once built with promises. The truth was that Sarah had been losing pieces of herself long before that, but she had worn her pain like an apron, tightly tied, neatly folded, always tucked beneath the smell of sugar and spice. 3 years earlier, just after her first miscarriage, Sarah had begun keeping to herself. The loss had come quiet. In the night, a small cramp, a drop of blood, then silence. Paul had not come home that night. He was out drinking with his friends, celebrating a contract that never came. When he returned in the morning, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, her palms stained red, her eyes empty. She had said nothing. He never asked. A month later, it happened again. And still, she kept quiet. Each time, she buried her grief in routine. Boil water, sweep floor, boil beans, smile, pretend. The third pregnancy held longer, almost to the 6th month. She had dared to hope, bought tiny clothes from a Owino market, even sewn a small blanket from scraps. But then, on a hot Thursday afternoon, she collapsed, behind the house while washing clothes. A neighbor rushed her to the clinic, but it was too late. The nurse never met her eyes. Paul arrived late, again. He looked at the blanket, said nothing. After that, something inside Sarah died. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was more like the soft extinguishing of a flame. She began to move through the house like smoke, visible but without weight. Her laughter vanished. Her cooking lost taste. Paul stopped trying. Or maybe, she thought now, he never truly started. And when he finally walked out the door, calling her useless, she felt no surprise. Just confirmation. Like the closing of a long, bitter chapter she'd been too tired to finish reading. That is why the first cupcake she baked, on that cold morning after her final cry, wasn't just food. It was a funeral offering, a prayer, a way to give form to the formless grief inside her. The heat of the oven, the scent of vanilla, the soft texture of the sponge. It gave her something her heart had lost. Shape, control, warmth. Every cake since then had been like that. Every sale, a whisper to the ones she lost. I'm still here. No, one knew. They only saw the strength, the smile, the ambition. But grief is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet excellence, the kind that gets awards. Back in the village, Paul sat in the borrowed room behind his cousin's carpentry shop, watching videos of her success on his borrowed phone. Each time her face appeared, shining in a bright dress, her voice calm and confident, he felt something sour in his chest. Regret, maybe. Shame, definitely. But also confusion. He had not known her fully. He had never asked why she stayed so quiet after the pregnancies failed. Never sat with her in her pain. He thought foolishly that she had moved on. But now, watching her speak on national TV about resilience, about rebuilding from rejection, he realized she hadn't been rebuilding from his words. She had been rising from something much deeper. She had buried their children with her hands, and he had buried her spirit with his silence. That night, Paul walked to her gate for the first time. He didn't knock. He just stood there, holding the hem of his shirt, watching the lights in her house flicker. It looked warm inside, alive. There was laughter, women talking, someone dropping a spoon, music from a small radio. Life was blooming inside those walls. And for the first time in years, he realized he was no longer a part of it. He stepped away from the gate, quietly, respectfully. Inside the house, Sarah felt a cold shiver at her neck. Not fear. Instinct. She walked to the window and looked out, but the street was empty now. She stared for a moment longer, then pulled the curtain shut. The past, she thought, doesn't always knock. Sometimes, it watches from the shadows. The next morning, she woke up before dawn, tied her headscarf, and opened her baking book. The old one, her mother's. On the final page, in faded blue ink, were words she hadn't noticed in years. The secret ingredient is always the pain you've survived. Just make it sweet. Sarah smiled. She flipped to a clean page and began to write a new recipe. It would be called Hearts That Didn't Break. A red velvet cake with a hint of lemon, bittersweet, beautiful, bold, like her. The village of Kira had changed, but in quiet, invisible ways, the kind only time and pain can shape. Roads were still dusty, children still chased old tires with sticks, and women still gathered under trees to peel cassava and gossip. But now, when they spoke Sarah's name, it was with respect, not pity. Little girls pointed to her when asked, "Who do you want to be when you grow up?" And young women, trapped in dead marriages or dreams that hadn't yet breathed, found in her a strange kind of courage, not loud, but steady, like the rhythm of a well-worn drum. Sweet Fire had become more than a business. It had become a place of rebirth. Inside the shop, Sarah no longer worked alone. The 3 girls she had trained now handled most of the daily orders. She focused on recipes, branding, and mentoring. Once a month, she held a small workshop in her backyard. Nothing fancy, just benches, shade from a mango tree, and stories. Women came from miles away, carrying babies on their backs and notebooks in their bags. They didn't just learn to bake. They came to hear her speak, to hear someone say, "You are not useless, you are just not finished yet." But not all healing is public. Some wounds close in silence, and some people, even the strongest, carry a weight that can't be shared. Sarah had begun to live again, yes, but she hadn't forgotten. She couldn't. Late at night, after the world had gone quiet, she would sit on the veranda, sip lukewarm tea, and stare into the dark. In those quiet hours, the memories visited, not as pain anymore, but as ghosts of who she used to be. She let them come. She made peace with them. Paul never returned again. He remained a shadow, walking the edges of her story. Some said he moved to a nearby town, tried to start a carpentry workshop. Others said he was sick. But Sarah never asked, never followed, never searched. There were some doors, she believed, that were better left closed, not because they held monsters, but because they held the version of you that was dying to be reborn. And she had been reborn. One Sunday afternoon, the Minister of Small Enterprises visited the village to tour successful local businesses. Journalists followed. Cameras rolled. They asked her how she did it, how she rose from being abandoned to becoming an icon. Sarah smiled, took a breath, and said the words she had only written in her recipe book until then. Sometimes it's the people who leave you behind that unknowingly push you forward, and sometimes the most painful goodbyes are the most powerful beginnings. That clip went viral, over 2 million views in 1 week. It was shared by feminists, entrepreneurs, church groups, widows, and single mothers. Even schools began quoting her words on posters. But what they didn't know was that just before giving that interview, Sarah had stood alone in her kitchen, holding her apron against her chest. She had looked at her reflection in the oven door, not a perfect mirror, but enough to see the woman she had become. A woman who once lay on the floor broken, who once wanted to disappear, who had once whispered to herself in the dark, "Maybe he's right." Now she stood straight, calm, whole. She walked outside and joined the crowd, her head high. That night, after the cameras were gone and the village went back to its slow hum, Sarah walked to her garden. It had grown wild lately, beans climbing, the fence, tomatoes softening on the vine. But she didn't mind. Wild things, she had learned, often survive the longest. She knelt down and pulled out a small wooden box buried behind a guava tree. Inside were 3 tiny knitted blankets, the ones she had made for the children she never got to hold. She laid them out on the grass, one by one. "I didn't fail you," she whispered. "I found a way to keep us alive." The wind moved, gently, like a soft hand brushing her cheek. A firefly danced past her nose. Somewhere far off, a drum echoed through the hills, maybe a wedding, maybe a vigil. But here, in this quiet space between grief and grace, Sarah sat with her children, her pain and her power. In the morning, she would bake again. The next cake on her list was called Forgiveness. A cinnamon honey blend, light and warm, with a slight burn at the back of the tongue, to remind people that sweetness earned through pain tastes different than any sugar sold in stores. She would sell it by the slice, and every slice would carry a story of a woman who was called useless, who was left behind, and who rose not in spite of that, but because of it. And if Paul ever walked by again, if he ever dared to speak, she would still smile, as she had before. She would still wave politely, but she would never turn around.